Chavre, was macht ihr? I hope everyone is gesund, stark und freilich, begashmis beruchnis. I hope everyone is strong, healthy and happy physically and spiritually. Today is Chav Gimel Tammuz, Erev Shabbos Kodesh, Pinchas Pinchas. We're in one of the Shabbosim of the 3 weeks, Shabbos Mevorchim Menachem Ov. The last 2 weeks we already started speaking about Nisim and about the Shabbosim of the 3 weeks, and how something which externally might look like something which is a problem, a negative, turns out to be a positive. So even though in Inyan it would be proper to still speak about the subject of the Shabbosim of the 3 weeks, but since we spoke so much about it last week, today we're going to speak about another subject which is just as relevant and important. Before we start, I'll say what it's about, because the pasuk that we're going to pray, the verse of prayer, actually immediately gets into it. What we're going to talk about something today is a huge subject. It's going to cover man's personal mission statement, your individual role and path in life and in your service of Hashem. And that opens up into many other areas in general. The idea of, which we spoke many times, how in the service of Hashem, there's yichud and there's bittul. There's the aspect of you as an individual, as a particular, with all your idiosyncrasies and eccentricities. Serve Hashem and channel it and elevate it towards Hashem and for Hashem's service. But then there's the idea of how we're all common. Bittul, self-nullification. We become all equally a member of Hashem's army. What role you have in Hashem's army is different. But the fact that you are a soldier, and that way you're all the same. So this is a very important balance. And I believe that this concept of yichud and bittul, as we mentioned many, many times in the past 2 years, really has impact in every single realm, concept, idea in Yiddishkeit. And the subject that we're going to discuss today will cover that also. So, excuse me. Let's start with the prayer. This prayer is very connected to the 3 weeks. And this about is really the only thing which is particularly connected to the 3 weeks that we're going to speak about today. And that is the song that the Rebbe asked to be sung by almost every Farbrengen at the end through Chazan Telashevsky. Yehi Rotzoin, Yehi Rotzoin, Milfonecho, Hashem Elokeinu, Elokei Aviseinu, Sheyiboneh Beis Hamikdosh B'meiro V'yomeinu, V'sein Chelkeinu B'seirosecha. We turn to Hashem, we ask a prayer. It should be your will, Hashem, and the God of our forefathers, that the Beis Hamikdash should be built speedily in our days, and we should have our portion in your Torah. So what's the connection between the fact that we're urgently asking Hashem to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash today? We want Mashiach now, we want Mashiach now. And the fact that we say, V'sei chalkeinu b'seirosecha, that each one of us should have our portion in the Torah. And now let's talk about what's this idea of V'sei chalkeinu b'seirosecha. So first let's talk about what the idea is, and then we'll answer the question, possibly, that we just mentioned. So, for those that are familiar with the Hagdama of Tanya, the famous Hagdama Samalakat, Alter Rebbe wrote an Hagdama, and the issue that he's addressing is that every person has Mekoymoi Haprati Shebetayra, a particular part, a section, an area of art, which is related to every single person as an individual, which is related to that person and no other person. So here, as we spoke many times, on the one hand, what's the number one pasuk, the first pasuk that Judaism says a parent should teach his child? Torah tziva lanu meirasha kilas Yaakov. That the entire Torah is a meirasha. And the chiddush on the word meirasha is an inheritance to every single Jew. And as we spoke many times, why is this the first pasuk? Because every person has to identify with Torah and say, it's mine. And that's the point. On the one hand, that pasuk, Torah tziva lanu meirasha kilas Yaakov, which is the first pasuk, the foundation of everything else that follows in the Jew's education for the rest of his entire life, starts with what? That I am connected to the Torah, as is everyone else. And my I, that's connected to Torah when I use this verse, is saying my I, regardless of my level of intelligence, regardless of my level of character traits, regardless of anything. And that's the whole word of Moirasha. The Jewish law is a Yerush is b'makam ha-Moirish, which means you have a parent, God forbid something happens to the parent and the child inherits. We don't care if the child weighs 5 pounds, newborn, or the child weighs 250 pounds. We don't care if the child has an IQ of the child, and the child can be a baby, like we just said, or a 50-year-old. Or the child has an IQ which is on the lower spectrum, or a child has an IQ on a genius spectrum. We don't care if the child is a Rosh Hashiva, an academic, a professor, a rabbi, or whether he's a truck driver, plumber, electrician, construction worker. It's irrelevant. That's the whole word. Torah. You should know, my child, my kind. Torah, tziva lanu Moshe. This Torah that Moshe gave us. Moirasha. It's your inheritance. Sedain Torah. It doesn't make a difference if your name is Yankiv, Berel, Shmerel, you're Shevet, Yisrael, Kohen, or Levi. It doesn't make a difference of your level of IQ or your level of character traits. It's your Torah. It's your inheritance. Fine. But as we just explained, that pasuk comes to tell us how there's no specific part that's connected to me, and rather every single part is connected to everyone. So how does that fit with the verse we just said now, the prayer? We're saying Chelkeinu v'seirosecha Chelkeinu, which means I have my portion, our portion. Each person has their own individualistic portion, as the Alter Rebbe said, like the Lakit. Mekoy me'aprati. And as the Rebbe brought many times, but the Alter Rebbe writes in Igeres HaKodesh that every single person has their chelik in Torah, which they have to be mechadish. Imagine God comes to the Jewish nation and he says, let's just theoretically say, let's say there's 16 million Jews, and he makes the following announcement. There are 16 million pearls or diamonds. Let's say pearls, because we use an analogy of an ocean. There are 16 million pearls buried in the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. Every single pearl of those 16 million has a person's name on that pearl. A different person's name on each pearl. Your mission, even if you decide not to accept it, is to uncover, dive deep, discover the pearl that has your name on it. Because no one else will be able to discover that pearl. It just doesn't work. It doesn't click. It won't become unlocked unless you take your personal DNA of your neshama and match it with the personal DNA of that pearl. That's what's going on over here. In the Torah is built in its DNA in Chachmosei Atzmis. Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's a part which parallels, which is meant to match up and be in sync, aligned with your neshama. And that's the way it is. And we're not going to go into the whole profundity of what I just said, how this is also an area of bittul and yichud together. Bittul, when you learn Torah, you have to know, you make a birchas HaTorah, it has to be be'ema, be'ira, be'reser, be'ziyah. You have to feel if you're standing in front of God Himself, and nullify yourself, and make yourself a vehicle for a revelation of purity, of God's wisdom. And you do that by emptying yourself, getting rid of your ego, putting your individuality aside, trying to make yourself invisible, trying to make yourself transparent, so to speak. But then we say, no. You have to use your brains, your ingenuity, your creativity, and discover that pearl, that gem of Torah intellect that has your name written on it, that's waiting for this to be discovered, and Hashem is waiting for you and you alone, because you alone could discover that gem. And now we can understand the connection Yesh leimar. Sheibana beis hamikdash made the main of v'sein chalkeinu b'zeresecha. Because the v'sein chalkeinu b'zeresecha is not that we're waiting for Mashiach to come, and then it's going to be v'sein chalkeinu. The v'sein chalkeinu b'zeresecha means now each one of us will discover their unique gem of Torah that they're meant to discover. Then we'll have the whole Torah, Shleimus HaTorah, in a revealed way, and that will bring Mashiach. So there's different levels of completion, of refinement, that has to come about in order to bring the complete redemption. Okay, so now we just saw how it is in Torah. This idea of man's individual Torah novelty that he has to reveal. Now, let's talk about mitzvahs. About mitzvahs, we have a very, very similar discussion. But before we get to mitzvahs, let's go to this week's parsha. And then we'll connect it to mitzvahs, and I hope we'll halt and cup and remember. What do we have in this week's parsha? Talk about miracles. We spoke about miracles in Parshas Balak. We spoke about miracles in Parshas Chukas, and now we're going to another miracle of this week's parsha. And the miracle in this week's parsha is when it talks about dividing the land. And the pasuk says, "Ach begoyrel yichalek es haaretz." The land was divided up through a lottery. Ach begoyrel yichalek es haaretz lishmeis matos avoisam yincholu. And it says, "Al pi hagoyrel techolek nachlosei bein rav lemot." According to the lot, shall one's inheritance be divided between the many and the few. Rashi immediately over here in two places, one after the other, Kamat, explains the precision of the word al pi hagoyrel, which literally is translated according to the mouth of the girl. And what does Rashi say? What does it mean according to the mouth? Because hagoyrel atzmoi haya the lot itself would shout and say. And right after that, in the pasuk following it, Rashi again on the words al pi hagoyrel, al pi hagoyrel. Rashi says hagoyrel hoya medaber. The lot would speak. K'moshe pirashti. So that's an outright miracle. And according to the announcement that the lot, the paper or the parchment would say what land belonged to which shevet, that's how it was divided. So from here we see the idea of a lottery and how, it's the ultimate resolution. That's why even in daily life people have an argument or something. They say, you know what, let's make a girdle. They make a lottery, and according to what happens in the girdle, that they all agree will follow the girdle. So this is the source. But in the case of the Chumash, it was actually clearly Hashem leading it, because the girdle would speak. So it's a clear miracle. So now, the Rebbe, what I'm going to say now, is based on Likutei Sichos Chelik Beis Pinchas. The Rebbe says that this is also referring to man's personal role and mission, what form his avodah should take. Should he be a teacher? Should he be a rabbi? Should he be a sheikhet? Should he be a moil? Should he be a sefer? Should he open up a grocery store? So the Rebbe is saying that man's journey, man's life's mission is al pi hagoyrel. It's decided according to the lot, which means you have a neshama, you have a mission. In that neshama is the DNA, the personal DNA, which is about how you will have to fulfill your individualistic role that no one else could fulfill. Imagine the Jewish nation, 16 million pieces of a puzzle. Each piece of the puzzle is shaped differently. Your shape is different than every other shape, and if your shape is not here, the whole puzzle is missing. So, in that sense, a girdle, according to Chassidus, is makifim. It's something which is higher than you. It's something which is beyond you. If you leave something up to your own judgment and your own choice, you might make the wrong choice. By definition, you have an agenda. By definition, You have you're bribed by your own interests, etc. But when it comes from outside of yourself, and God is the ultimate one who assesses properly, that's what it means. Al pi hagoyrel. God has decided, based upon the DNA of your neshama, what is your individualistic role. And I think a very good marshal for this, I've spoken to many people I know that went to the Israeli army, and one person wants to be a parrot. There's very famous brigades, Golani Brigade, Tzanchanim. There's many different brigades, and I know people, young youth of Melbourne, they're training themselves, they're working on their muscles, this part of the body, that part of the body, they're full of ideas. This one wants to be a paratrooper. Sorry. This one wants to be a paratrooper, this one wants to be a sniper, this one wants to be a diver, whatever it is. And in the end, usually they do not end up where they dreamt that they wanted to be, because they join the Israeli army and then they get what's called a psych test and everything that entails. So trust me, the Israeli army will assess you and come to the conclusion whether you're a professional scrambled eggs maker, whether you're the professional entertainment, because there's people that have to entertain the troops, and that's your part of the army, whether your job is to maintenance, you're a professional specialist in maintenance, whether you're in intelligence, whether you write up the strategic plans, whether you're a pilot, whether you're a sailor, etc., etc., etc. So you're going to say they made a mistake. Of course, this is not the good marshal for Hashem, because this is a human being, and human beings are mortal and fallible and can make mistakes. But let's say when you say, like, the X-ray doesn't lie. The X-ray doesn't lie. You took an X-ray, now you can say the X-ray made a mistake. So too it's with Hashem. Hashem is the ultimate, perfect evaluator. And He created your neshama, so to speak. He knows what you don't know. He sees what you don't see. So on the part of your neshama, there's a chelik in Torah that belongs to you in particular. And there's a mitzvah that's related to you in particular. And there's a shlichus in particular you have to fulfill. Now the question is, how do we find out which is our particular role? And as a matter of fact, in a certain sense, that's exactly the purpose of the whole Likutei Amorim Tanya, the whole masterpiece of the Alter Rebbe. He wrote with that in mind. And that was the question. And that's why one would go to the Rebbe, knock on the door, and say, Rebbe, what about me? What's my personal role? What's my personal path? Noida b'sharim baila. Kol chad v'chad l'fum shir delay. How do I connect with God? Not only as organized religion, but as me. Very, very deep, personal, existential question. And for that purpose, the Alter Rebbe wrote to Tanya to help us deal with that issue. Now let's go to mitzvahs for a second. We see the same thing about mitzvahs. Again, every person is obligated to fulfill 630 mitzvahs. We'll keep this brief. So you can't say one mitzvah is more yours than the other. In a way. You have to perform and fulfill every single mitzvah with utmost attention, devotion, and dedication and commitment. But guess what? Alter Rebbe in Tanya also writes about this at length, about the Gemara, which says one person asked the other person, and what was your father especially careful? And the Alter Rebbe explains that it's talking about a question about a mitzvah. Which mitzvah did your father treat or perform especially carefully or with extra energy? And the Alter Rebbe says, amazing, that the word Zohar means shine. Zeh Ashar Hashem. Every person has one mitzvah that's his. He has a special connection to that mitzvah. To that mitzvah, everything else follows. Everything else shines. And that's why, usually, if we talk about mitzvahs, a person will feel a certain affinity to a certain mitzvah. Some people are crazy about mezuzah. Some people are crazy about kashrus. Some people are crazy about limdat Torah. Some people are crazy about mezuzah. I mentioned that, whatever. The reason is because that's the DNA of your neshama. That mitzvah is the mitzvah of Zohar Tvei, which literally means which mitzvah was your father careful about. I didn't mention this before. And according to Chassidus, the inner dimension of Torah, Zohar Tvei means in which mitzvah do you shine, does your neshama come out more, which means your neshama is more in sync and aligned with that mitzvah. Okay, now let's get to the bigger picture, into the Sikha and Chelik Beis. And the truth is, I'm going to tell you what the Rebbe says in Chelik Beis, and I'm going to tell you the other side of the coin, where we see usually how the Rebbe dealt with it. So one way, so this is also like the general question: how do you know you're doing the right thing? It's a big question. This is the talk of the lecture. How do we know when you're doing the right thing? It's a big question. So this also is the sort of question over here today. How do you know when you're doing the right thing? What's your thing? What's meant to be my thing? So one way, first I'll say the way which is not according to the Sikha, more in line with what I said till now, is that when a person sees where he's talented, where he has an aptitude, where he's naturally inclined, what he's good at, so then usually that could be a sign. I'm stressing could be, because we're soon going to change tracks. That very well could be a sign that this is where he's meant to excel. Focus on that. Go with it all the way. And most of the time we see the Rebbe giving that guidance. Most of the time. I would say, I don't know, I'm not such a big scholar to say exactly. I'm not such a big expert in this. But from what I've seen in videos and people asking the Rebbe questions, it's usually an area which you developed or where you have a talent, art, music, mathematics. The Rebbe would usually encourage continuing, fostering and developing the full potential of that particular ability and to excel in it. And that's your role. The Rebbe says, I need a mathematics professor who's going to be a role model of how to be active in Judaism. I need a professor of philosophy. I need a scientist, etc., etc., etc. But in Likutei Sichos Chelik Beis, this week's parsha, while he's talking on this pasuk, Ach begoyrel chalukes haaretz, which he's translating according to Chassidus, that begoyrel, something outside of yourself, a lottery, is what is deciding what your thing to do is, and usually, actually, it might be that very area which you find the most difficult. So let's change tracks a bit, but let's say a person has an addiction. I'm talking the negative, but let's say an addiction in gambling, or an addiction of smoking, or an alcoholic, or he's very lazy, or he's disorganized, and he finds that the thing he doesn't want to deal with, and he's actually excelling in other areas. So usually the way of Chassidus is, how do we say, koch sich and I say toiv, stress the positive, and then little by little the negative will be taken care of. But according to the Sikha of this week in Chelik Beis Pinchas, the Rebbe seems to emphasize, guess what? It's very likely in that very area where you're the weakest, i.e., where you're having the strongest struggle, and you're finding it the most difficult. That's really where your greatest strength is lying. Because this is the proof by the fact that your evil inclination is opposing it the most. So the thing which feels that the most resistance inside of you to do, and you're always pushing it off, that may be the very thing which is the most important thing for you to deal with. And that may be the thing, the real thing why you came down to this world. And that may be the thing which, once you accomplish that thing, you'll be able to strive and ascend completely, exponentially higher, because you were distracted from from the main thing which you meant to do the whole time. So we have a bit of a dilemma here. We have a bit of a paradox. We have a bit of a contradiction. How do I know what's my main thing? The thing which I find the most difficult, or the thing which I find that I'm very talented at? And the answer is that I don't know really 100% the answer. You have to speak to your local mashpia. What I have considered, what I humbly think is a slight answer, based upon most of the guidance of the Rebbe, I would say is that you should primarily, time-wise, focus on the thing which you have an aptitude for and an inclination for, and channel it and concentrate it to use it for Hashem. And you'll see the most return on the investment. But on the other hand, because this is the other side to it too, the thing which involves more blood, sweat, and tears, and work, and effort, which you don't necessarily see the results so quickly. You have to have an element of that also in your life. And also, for two reasons. Number one, because who knows, that might be the main area where you're really supposed to be focusing on. And two, without elaborating right now, based on the Alter Rebbe in chapter 15 of Tanya, the real sign of serving God is when you're able to go out of your character profile. You're able to do that which doesn't fit your profile. You're able to do that which is difficult for you. So that's also very true. It's only in those things that are where you're really stretching yourself that you're really serving God in a way that's proof positive that you're serving God, because you'd rather not do this because it's harder for you. But you know that this is what the Eibishter also wants. So that's the test. So in summation, I would say this is a very big question. It's a very huge question about what's my specific role. And we see how important it is, as we spoke today in Torah and in mitzvahs, and the idea of ach b'gerli chalkas haaretz. It's essential for you to feel fulfilled on a personal level. I found myself. I found my individual role. I found what I bring to the table and what I'm meant to bring to the table, my unique contribution that no one else can do. But at the same time, it should also involve definitely an aspect where it's something which makes you sometimes uncomfortable. It'll cause you to sweat more, etc., as you discussed previously. I'll just quickly, the connection to Pirkei Avos. We'll just talk for 2 seconds. It's so late already. It's amazing how in the first mission of Pirkei Avos, we forget that the first instruction of Pirkei Avos is have a misunim badin. So go over to a regular person and say something on Pirkei Avos. Okay, everyone's going to say, it starts off, Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai. We all know the Batanura. Why does Avos start Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai? Fine. But now, has anybody given a talk and thought about the focus? What's the first din in Pirkei Avos? Just like everyone knows the beginning of Shulchan Aruch, the first instruction about Shvisi Havana and the summit and getting up in the morning, etc. You know what the first instruction of the first Mishnah of the first Perek in Pirkei Avos is? Have a Misunim Badin. And then it says, and what does it mean to have a Misunim Badin? So I'm just going to say it for 2 seconds, even though we could elaborate on this on another shir. It means assess, evaluate your students. On one level, it's talking to the teacher. Before we come to V'amidah Tamidim Harbe, it's telling you how you really be successful. And this is the paradox. Even though you're aiming to influence more people, Harbe, to have many students, guess what? The real key to success, to make real students, but good students, many, is by giving each one, having assessed each one personally, individually. Like if you give a proper psych test, not only how he could serve the army best, so to speak, but what are his individualistic talents and advantages. And think about how best for him to maximize his potential, him, as him alone, as an individual, then you'll be more successful. So this is something which is, I think, very, very important and amazing, that the first instruction of Pirkei Avos is an instruction about individuality. So to finish off with the story that everyone knows, and which actually is going to be a proof positive to the second side of the coin, where you do something which is not necessarily we have a special inclination to, is the most famous story with Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Olav Shalom. He was a student and he was told by his friends, when you go into the Rebbe in Yechidus and ask him what you want to do with your life, give the Rebbe 3 options, 3 choices. And usually the Rebbe will choose one of those 3. Because that's what happened in 99.9% of the cases. So the way Rabbi Sachs says the story is, he went to the Rebbe, he wrote down 3 options. The 3 options were, number 1, he wanted to choose a career in academia, academics, to become a professor. Number 2, he liked economy, so he was figuring on becoming an economist. And number 3, he figured to become a barrister, an advocate. And he wrote to the Rebbe these 3 choices, and the Rebbe went through each one and said, no, no, no. And the way he says the story was, the Rebbe wasn't following his own rules. And then he said, you should go into the rabbinate, etc., etc. I'm not going to go into the details. So look at this story. And as they say, the rest is history. Here you have a super talented individual who's not a child, is a Mahus Adam. So a second ago, he was already visualizing his life, how he's going to become a top star in one of these areas. And he goes to the Rebbe, and obviously when he wrote those 3 choices, that's what he's good at, that's what he wants, that's what he's dreaming about. One of those 3. And he goes to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says, nope, that's not you. I'm a Rebbe, I see in your soul, and if I'm telling you, your DNA is to become the chief rabbi of the Commonwealth one day, etc., etc., etc. So, Rebbe, begoirel, something that's higher than you, something that's beyond you, something that can see into the very depth of your soul and your essence. And the Rebbe saw in Jonathan Sachs that his soul DNA was to become the chief rabbi of the Commonwealth. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, when he gives this speech, he would say, and in the end, I accomplished all the other 3 objectives also. So the Eibusher should help. And this is the bracha we all ask. We should all be fulfilling our shlichus in the right way to feel personal fulfillment. And if each person will fulfill their mission the way they're meant to be, this will definitely bring the Gula Mitzvah Shleima take of Miyad Mamish. Posting from my home, Be'ez Hashem Yisbarach, your man in Melbourne.